Hello, Kevin. How are you today?
Fine, Finn. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks. So I think we wanted to discuss something a little bit different this time. We wanted to discuss about time, the concept of time. And I think you wrote an article a couple of months ago, actually, called The Clash of Hemispheres. That's very interesting. And I recommend to all of you who are watching this to go read the article. But we're going to be talking about some parts of this article today. So please go ahead, Kevin, and I'm going to share the article on my screen here.
Okay. One of the themes of my work is to capture a contrast in the mode of thinking, generally speaking, between Westerners and Easterners. And so this is Ian McGilchrist is a philosopher and a neuroscientist, and he's come up with a way, one another way of capturing this. And for him, he through scientific experimentation and everything, this isn't just things he made up, but he divides the brain into a left brain and a right brain. And now I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and back then there was a similar kind of division that the right brain was creative and the left brain, I don't know. But it's not that. Here, McGilchrist has shows that the left brain is far more detail oriented. And in terms of time, it's very much into the present and detail oriented. Whereas the right side of the brain is much bigger picture, larger scope. And so one analogy, and this isn't just for humans, this is for many, certainly most mammals. And it comes one way of showing this dual brain in action is when an animal's eating something in the wild, their left brain concentrates on what they're actually eating, looking at the details and figuring out where the meat is or whatever, where the nutrition is, whereas the right brain is scanning the horizon for threats. So in a sense, they don't want to be prey, the word prey is interesting because it's also, they have captured some prey, but they also, in a sense, have to prey. In other words, have a big picture image to make sure they're not captured. And so once we start with that, then we come, McGilchrist divides these two. His main theory is that the West is far too left brain. It's too detail oriented, too short term oriented. And we've heard this often. Now, this isn't always the case. Obviously, when we're making these generalizations, there's plenty of exceptions. And
Of
so,
course.
but as a general rule, there's other books too that I reference that in general, the West tends towards an immediacy, a short-term thinking, whereas the East is much more holistic, kind of dialectical, that they see things in cycles and time. I mean, when you speak to Chinese people, they're quite often referencing 2,000 years ago, or even the Iranians are talking about the length of their civilization.
Of
And
course.
so this is this starts so my reflection started with that, but now if we go on to time, there's there, there's a great French historian, Fernand Braudel, who has who was active in the 20th century. He's super well known among people who are fanatic about history, and he's probably the biggest influence on my thinking of anyone. And so he, what's interesting, for he started out as a historian relatively normal. So in the West, historians tend to be more event based, like a statesman, a war, an event, telling a very kind of short story. So he developed a book. This is before World War II, like in the late 1930s, about the Mediterranean area between 1550, say during the 16th century, concentrating a lot on the clash between the Spanish Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And so in his, but so then the war broke out. He fought in the French army for a year and he was captured, and he spent 5 years in captivity, where he developed this book, but he didn't have any of his details. He didn't have the research that he had. In other words, he was forced to go towards his right brain and start thinking in much bigger uh, images and details. And so his book, which is the Mediterranean during the epoch of Philip II, is divided into three sections. And the first section, you can see the milieu means the environment. But this means the Mediterranean itself, the geological time of the Mediterranean. And this is something that's very famous with Braudel. It's called the longue durée. Actually, in English, it's a French term, the long duration. But and so his the first part of the book it gives you the very big picture of the Mediterranean, the geology, the mountains, the rivers. And if we make another, it's because I'm an architect, a very simple analogy would be a site plan where you see all the buildings of a complex at once. And so the second uh, temporal structure that he looks at is called conjunctures. And that would be like say 100 years, there's no real time, but the lifespan of an empire, say that the lifespan of the United States would be a conjuncture. It's so far, it's what, 250 years. And so then he in his story he broke down different empires and told stories along those lines. And so one thing, Fernand Braudel is very interested in capitalism, theories of capitalism, and so he would say that capitalism started after Venice, and then there were different cycles of accumulation: the Genovese, the Dutch, the British, and then now the American, and perhaps soon the Chinese. And then the third part of the book is events, événements. And so this is basically journalistic events. It'd be like the COVID pandemic or the Ukraine war or something that could span a year or two, or maybe even just a murder or something. It's like things that we're kind of obsessed with day to day, that especially in the West, that we tend towards this kind of like looking at events, looking at the tweet, looking at very short term type things. And so if all your vision is basically just in the events, it's like that animal eating just the meat. You're not looking at the big picture. And so one of my goals, I know you're similar, is to always try to put things into a deeper context, not necessarily historically, but often historical, and in order to put the events that we're doing within the context of a larger time frame.
But let me make a couple of comments here because I think it's very interesting. I think what's really original in what you're saying is that a left brain would be more close to the Western Hemisphere and right brain closer to the Eastern Hemisphere. And there we have this clash, this lack of understanding, misunderstanding between East and West. And we can see it very clearly between, the United States, which really a representative, even more than Europe, is a representative of the Western Hemisphere. So you have the United States with Russia, really not so much understanding each other, and Russia, of course, being the most Eastern European country, which has, of course, a side which is a little bit Asian, which with its influence of Byzantium, right? And then on the other hand, we have also the right brain, which is another perception of time, as you said, the Asian perception of time with also the older civilizations. But I would also like to add another point, which is the capitalist system, when it develops, tends to reduce interest rates, right? And when interest rates are reduced, you reduce your time preference. You get a lower time preference. That means that you are more open to longer term projects, more open to receiving returns of investment over longer time. That's why in the more developed capitalist system, you have the possibility of investing over the long term to see the return, a very good return, but over the very long term, right? Whereas in the less developed economies, you will rarely find such long-term projects. People are going to think much more on a short-term return on investment, also because interest rates are going to be higher. So that's kind of interesting because it goes slightly against, or it's counter a little bit to what you're saying, because of course, the most developed economies in the world, in particular the United States, also have naturally, right, the lowest interest rates. But despite this, you still have this huge influence of the culture, basically meaning that despite the fact that the projects, investment projects, are actually the longer and the most risky in the United States, despite this, you still have this very, very short-term view, even short-term view from a capitalist perspective, because you want a short-term return on investment, you want to invest and you want the stock market to go up tomorrow. You have KPIs that go to the next quarter, whereas it's in China, especially state investments, maybe not so much private investments, if you can call anything a private investment in China. But anyway, state investments tend to be much more long term, much more strategic. Um, they will invest over 20 years, 30 years in terms of, for example, chipset manufacturing and development, in terms of rare earth processing, etc.
50
So
years, yeah.
this is kind of interesting because it is, in one way, it's sort of aligned with what you're saying, and in another way, it's a little bit countering this what you're saying, because basically in the Western Hemisphere, that's where capitalism developed first, and as a result of that, they should be more long-term thinking. But here we can see how the culture is actually impacting the US way of thinking much more than the economic system, perhaps.
I think there's another dichotomy that Braudel talks about all the time, and that's the difference between financialization and production. And so, what you're talking about, the US is very financialized right now. And so, they're not making investments necessarily into a factory or to, productive invents. They're like basically just gambling on the stock markets or
Yeah, yeah, I
it's not,
agree.
it's just a very short term thing, moving money around. We'll make money here, we'll make money there. Whereas, like you said, with the Chinese, they're trying to capture markets.
Yeah.
They're trying to create monopoly
Well,
situations,
and they're trying also
like
to
with rare
develop,
earths.
they're trying also to develop their societies
Exactly.
to bring actually a better standard of living for their citizens. Not all states think in this way, and the Chinese state, of course, is far from perfect and has proven itself to be also not only inefficient sometimes, but also aggressive. For example, during the COVID era and also before. But nevertheless, that's kind of an interesting point. It's perfectly true what you're saying, that this financialization has basically distorted this original American capitalism that existed in the 19th century and the early 20th century.
Yeah, what you're talking about is Fordism, is the old the factories, and America
Not
developed
only
that.
not only Fordism, not
But
only that, but anyway, that's interesting. So let's get back to this time aspect. So how do you see this dichotomy, or this let's say this difference in perception of time between the East and the West? Then, if you get into the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere.
I mean, in terms of right now, so we're at a very crucial point within the global order, where the U.S. leadership reign is seems to be coming to an end. Particularly if you have a Chinese, if you have a long term or a Brodelian point of view, you see these things as cycles, and you see all the what he says are the signs of autumn, which is financialization. When he would go back through the Dutch, the British, he would see that when you go turn to financialization, that's basically the end of your reign. It's the final years. It's like a life cycle. You're getting
Good point.
old. You're going to the
And
senior
of course,
citizens home.
inflation as well, right? To have an inflationary policy, economic policy. We saw what the Romans were doing with the Roman coins, right? As when the difficulties arise, social and economic difficulties arise in the Roman Empire, but also outside, they will tend to print more money. One way of
Yes.
devaluing
Yeah.
the currency is also to nibble gold or silver off the Roman coins, in order, and
We
that's
have a
basically what inflation is, right?
yes. So we have a similar thing going on with the US dollar, but because it's the reserve currency, it has so much power that the US can get away with nibbling and printing and printing. It gets away with it until it doesn't get away with it, and it still has a little ways to go. It's not going to collapse tomorrow, but you already see the Chinese and Eastern nations positioning themselves for a post dollar. And it's not like a lot of people think, oh, they hate the dollar, they want to fight the dollar. No, not at all. They love the dollar because they know a strong dollar financialization is destroying America. And
Yes, but
so
not only that, it's also because China actually has benefited a lot under this,
absolutely.
you know, US dominated financial system. This is under this system that they have made their wealth and they have developed. So they are not they did not have as a first priority to destroy this system, but
No.
if it's going to be used against them, that's something else. But about China, I wanted to give an example of how Chinese view time, especially very high level educated Chinese. Zhou Enlai was asked once in the 70s how he perceived the impact of the French Revolution, right? Which happened
Yes.
1789, so 200 years before. And he answered, well, I think it's a bit too early to say, you know.
I
I
know
mean,
that's
that's
yeah.
completely contrary to if you ask Trump that or Marco Rubio, they won't even know what we're talking about.
Yeah, they wouldn't even know what it is. And so, yes, that is a great example of this different aspect of time. And
All
so,
right.
yes, this is something very important when we study politics. As you know, Trump's like worried about the next midterm or the very short termism, whereas the East, the BRICS, have a much larger
Yeah,
vision temporally.
definitely. Definitely. And sometimes you get the feeling that Washington doesn't know what it's going to do the next weekend, you know, with respect to Iran. I mean, they're making up the strategy as they go along. So it's a bit worrying for the peace of the world. But in the end, it will be advantages to the chess players, namely the Iranians, as well as the Russians, who are also great chess players. But
Yeah.
anyway, so thanks for this. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, or shall we
No, I
stop
think
here?
we covered it all.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kevin.
All right. Thank you, Finn. Bye.
Bye bye.